She was found with her head removed. How did that happen?
Easy, just pick it up and move it.
What, you just pull the head off?
Yeah, it was already off.
Serial killers are terrifying enough, but seeing them lose control during interviews takes the horror to a new level. One case stands out above the rest. Richard Kuklinski, a killer who unleashed chilling threats during his interview, showing the true face of evil. Brace yourself. This one's unforgettable. Let's dive in.
How many people have you killed?
Lord, I don't know. I don't know.
10?
Yeah.
Tommy Lynn Sells wasn't just a serial killer. He was a drifter who brought chaos wherever he went. For over 2 decades, his nomadic lifestyle became the perfect cover for his brutal killing spree across multiple states. But it was during an ABC News interview that the true depths of his depravity were revealed. When the interviewer brought up one of his most heinous crimes, Sells didn't just deflect, he snapped, turning the conversation into a terrifying display of his dark and violent nature.
They were all innocent children. A son, a brother. Lives with limitless possibilities ahead of them.
Sells' violent tendencies began early. By the age of 14, he was homeless, hitchhiking across the U.S. and surviving on petty thefts. But it didn't stop there. At just 15 years old, Sells committed his first murder, killing a man who had offered him a ride. This marked the start of a reign of terror that spanned decades. Sells' pattern was chillingly random. He would break into homes at night, attacking his victims with whatever weapon was nearby. In 1999, he entered the Harris family home in Del Rio, Texas, where he slaughtered a father, attempted to kill his young daughter, Crystal, and left a bloody crime scene that horrified investigators. Perhaps the most horrifying of Sells' crimes occurred years later in Illinois. The Dardeen family's home became the scene of unspeakable violence. Keith Dardeen was shot execution-style. Their young son was beaten to death, and Elaine Dardeen, who was heavily pregnant, endured a savage beating that caused her to give birth. Sells' cruelty didn't end there. In an act so heinous it defied comprehension, he murdered the newborn as well. Investigators were left shattered by the sheer brutality. Sells' undoing came thanks to Crystal's resilience. Despite her injuries, she identified him, leading to his capture in 2000. Authorities were stunned by his confessions. Sells claimed responsibility for over 70 murders, though he was only convicted for 1. But Sells' arrogance didn't end with his arrest. His interviews revealed a man who thrived on fear and control, often describing his crimes with eerie detachment. Yet when pressed about specific incidents, like the pregnant woman he beat to death, Sells' carefully constructed facade cracked. In the ABC News interview, the tension in the room was palpable. Sells leaned forward, his voice laced with hostility, and locked eyes with the interviewer. "What do you think happens when your head hits the concrete?" he asked coldly, sending shivers through everyone present.
2 words I don't like to use is love and sorry, because I'm about hate.
His methods for killing were as random as the people he targeted. He raped many before cutting their throats or beating them.
On April 3, 2014, Tommy Lynn Sells was executed by lethal injection. Authorities believe he's connected to at least 22 murders, though the true number may never be known. His execution brought closure to some, but left many with lingering questions about the full extent of his crimes. In his final days, Sells remained unrepentant, holding on to the same arrogance that defined his interviews. For the families of his victims, his execution marked an end to the terror, but it would never erase the horrors he inflicted.
What did you see in his eyes?
To be honest, he seemed blank. I mean, there was no emotion.
The Dardeen family's story alone sent shockwaves through the community. Neighbors struggled to comprehend the cruelty, while investigators described the crime scene as one of the most disturbing they had ever encountered. Survivors like Crystal Harris face lifelong trauma, haunted by memories of Sells' violent outbursts.
I am hatred. When you look at me, you look at hate.
When I look at you, I look at hate?
When you look at me, you know what hate is. 'Cause I don't know what love is.
Sells' interview reactions, however, left a different kind of scar. The chilling moment when he fantasized about harming the interviewer revealed a mind so twisted that even death row couldn't tame him. It wasn't just his crimes that horrified people. It was the way he spoke about them, as if they were trophies. Tommy Lynn Sells' chilling threats during his interview revealed a mind consumed by violence. But the next killer, Arthur Shawcross, takes it even further.
Home to some of America's most violent criminals, one of them is Arthur J. Shawcross. Shawcross has murdered 11 women and is serving a 250-year prison sentence.
Arthur Shawcross seemed unremarkable at first glance, a quiet man living in upstate New York. But behind the unassuming exterior was a serial killer who preyed on the vulnerable. Known as the Genesee River Killer, Shawcross targeted women, leaving a trail of terror along the riverbanks. What makes his case unforgettable, however, isn't just the crimes. It's the way he spoke about them in chilling interviews, offering a glimpse into the mind of a man devoid of empathy. Shawcross's violent tendencies surfaced early in life. He spent his childhood setting fires, torturing animals, and showing signs of a deeply disturbed psyche. After serving in the Vietnam War, Shawcross claimed his experiences there shaped his violent behavior, though experts later doubted many of his war stories.
She was found with her head removed. How did that happen?
Easy, just pick it up and move it.
What, you just pull the head off?
Yeah, it was already off.
His killing spree began in 1972 when he murdered an 8-year-old boy and later a 10-year-old girl in Watertown, New York. Despite the heinous nature of the crimes, Shawcross served just 15 years after striking a plea deal. Upon his release, he relocated to Rochester, where his second wave of terror began. Between 1988 and 1990, Shawcross murdered 11 women, most of them adult workers. His methods were brutal: strangulation, mutilation, and disposing of their bodies along the Genesee River. Each victim's disappearance sent waves of fear through the community, and investigators struggled to identify the killer. Shawcross had learned from his past mistakes, carefully avoiding patterns that might expose him. Shawcross's reign of terror ended on January 3, 1990, when he was spotted near the scene of his last victim's murder. Police arrested him, and during interrogations he began confessing to the killings. What shocked investigators most wasn't just the confessions, but how cold and calculated Shawcross was when describing his crimes.
I didn't go all the way deep into the stomach area, just split her open. I don't know why.
In one of the most infamous interviews, Shawcross detailed his methods with a chilling lack of remorse. He spoke about his victims as if they were objects, describing their final moments with unsettling detachment. At one point, he calmly blamed his actions on a split personality and the trauma he claimed to have endured in Vietnam. The eerie calm in his voice contrasted sharply with the horror of his words, leaving viewers and investigators deeply unsettled. Shawcross was convicted of 10 murders in November 1990 and sentenced to life in prison without parole. During the trial, his defense team argued he suffered from brain damage and PTSD, but the jury rejected their claims. The evidence was overwhelming, and the testimonies of those who knew his victims painted a vivid picture of the devastation he caused. In prison, Shawcross continued to grant interviews, often relishing the attention. He maintained a cold, calculated demeanor, offering disturbing insights into his mindset. For many, his interviews were as haunting as his crimes, providing a rare but terrifying window into the psychology of a serial killer.
I'm just so happy for the other families.
The families of Shawcross's victims were left grappling with unimaginable grief. Mothers and fathers spoke of daughters lost too soon, women who had dreams of escaping their struggles, but instead fell prey to Shawcross's brutality. The community of Rochester remained shaken for years, haunted by the memory of a killer who walked among them undetected. Shawcross's interviews added another layer of horror: his monotone voice, the way he spoke of his crimes as mundane events, and his lack of remorse left viewers questioning how such evil could exist. It wasn't just his actions, but his unflinching demeanor that lingered in the minds of those who watched. Arthur Shawcross's chilling confessions revealed a man who thrived on his dark notoriety. But the next case takes us to Lonnie Franklin Jr., the Grim Sleeper, whose chilling calm during interviews masked the horrifying secrets of a killer who evaded justice for decades.
The coroner told me about these body dumps. There were 38 women on the list.
For decades, a predator stalked the streets of Los Angeles, preying on women in vulnerable neighborhoods. Known as the Grim Sleeper, Lonnie Franklin Jr. earned his nickname for the chilling 14-year gap between his known murders, leaving investigators baffled. But it wasn't just his crimes that made headlines. It was his unsettling reaction when confronted during interviews that revealed the twisted mind behind the terror. Franklin's reign of terror began in 1985, targeting women in South Los Angeles. Many of his victims were adult workers or struggling with addiction, which Franklin exploited. His method was brutal yet calculated. He'd lure his victims into his car, strangle or shoot them, and discard their bodies in alleys and dumpsters.
He preyed at night, trolling the streets of South Central LA.
The Grim Sleeper.
Grim Sleeper. Grim Sleeper.
Photos of 180 women discovered in the home of a suspected serial killer.
Police were slow to connect the dots, partly because his victims were from marginalized communities. Even after DNA evidence began to emerge in the late 80s, Franklin remained a ghost, leaving families heartbroken and the community gripped by fear. His killing spree mysteriously stopped in 1988, only to resume again in 2002, a gap that would become a dark hallmark of his nickname. Franklin's downfall came in 2010, thanks to a groundbreaking forensic technique called familial DNA matching. His son's DNA, collected during an unrelated arrest, partially matched evidence from the crime scenes, leading investigators to Lonnie Franklin Jr. When police raided his home, they uncovered a horrifying treasure trove of evidence. Inside were hundreds of photos of women, many of whom remain unidentified, and personal items linked to his victims. His quiet, unassuming life as a mechanic and family man shattered under the weight of the grisly truth. During interrogations, Franklin remained disturbingly calm, even denying the crimes outright. But when pressed, he'd lash out with chilling precision, trying to outmaneuver his interrogators. The most unnerving part wasn't just his denial. It was the casual indifference with which he spoke about the victims and the impact of his crimes. In 2016, after years of mounting evidence and a painstaking trial, Lonnie Franklin Jr. was convicted of 10 murders, though authorities believe he was responsible for many more. The jury sentenced him to death, and he was sent to San Quentin's death row. Franklin never showed remorse, sitting stone-faced in court as families poured out their grief and anger.
It is the judgment and sentence of this court that you shall suffer the death penalty.
While awaiting execution, Franklin's death came in 2020, not by lethal injection, but from natural causes. His passing left unanswered questions, including the identities of several women in the photos found at his home.
He took my daughter's life, along with the other lives that was taken.
The families of Franklin's victims were haunted not just by his crimes, but by his ability to hide in plain sight for so long. His detached demeanor during the trial and interrogations added another layer of pain. Survivors and their families described him as a predator who thrived on manipulating the system, knowing his victims were often dismissed by society. In interviews, Franklin's calm facade would occasionally crack, revealing the rage and narcissism lurking beneath. His dismissive attitude toward the lives he destroyed left audiences and investigators alike chilled to the bone. The image of a man who could live so normally, yet harbor such darkness, became the ultimate reminder of evil hidden in plain sight. Our next killer, Richard Kuklinski, known as the Iceman, offered a chilling glimpse into a man who turned murder into a profession.
Richard Kuklinski is one of the most dangerous criminals we have ever come across in this state. He murdered by guns, he murdered by strangulation, he murdered by putting poison on victims' food.
In suburban New Jersey, neighbors saw Richard Kuklinski as a quiet family man. Yet, behind closed doors, he was the infamous Iceman, a contract killer whose methods and demeanor sent shivers down the spines of even seasoned investigators. Known for freezing his victims to conceal their time of death, Kuklinski was a man whose crimes spanned decades and whose chilling interviews revealed a mind devoid of remorse. Kuklinski's violent journey began in the 1960s when he transitioned from petty theft to working for powerful mafia families like the Gambino and the Cavalcante organizations. His reputation for efficiency made him a sought-after hitman. No method was off-limits. Knives, poison, guns, and even his bare hands became tools of his trade. But Kuklinski's career wasn't just about fulfilling contracts. He often killed for personal reasons, targeting business associates, rivals, and even friends if he suspected betrayal. His need for control and quick temper turned minor conflicts into deadly confrontations. By the mid-1980s, authorities began piecing together Kuklinski's pattern of violence, culminating in a grisly discovery that would earn him his chilling nickname. In 1985, police found one of Kuklinski's victims encased in ice. Freezing the body had delayed decomposition and obscured the time of death, a method that demonstrated both his cunning and his willingness to go to extreme lengths to avoid capture. But this gruesome tactic would also lead to his undoing. The FBI launched Operation Iceman in 1985, enlisting undercover agent Dominic Polifrone to pose as a hitman, seeking Kuklinski's services. During their meetings, Kuklinski openly bragged about his methods, including the use of cyanide to kill his victims quickly and quietly. These conversations were recorded and became damning evidence. When Kuklinski agreed to carry out another murder, the FBI moved in, arresting him in a dramatic sting operation. Authorities uncovered a trove of evidence, including weapons and detailed records of his killings, sealing his fate. In 1988, Kuklinski faced trial for multiple murders. The courtroom was captivated by his chilling detachment. He described his crimes with clinical precision, showing no remorse for the lives he had taken. Prosecutors painted a picture of a man who killed not only for money, but for sport, finding satisfaction in the power he wielded over life and death. Sentenced to consecutive life terms, Kuklinski was imprisoned in Trenton, New Jersey. But his story didn't end there. From his prison cell, Kuklinski gave a series of interviews that revealed the full extent of his crimes and his cold, calculating nature.
What do you think about me? Anything good, bad, or indifferent?
Yeah, some of each.
The interviews offered an unsettling glimpse into Kuklinski's psyche. He spoke of his murders as though recounting mundane tasks, his tone calm and devoid of emotion. When pressed on his motivations, his demeanor shifted, his temper flaring in barely contained outbursts. Viewers saw a man whose violent tendencies simmered just below the surface, ready to erupt at the slightest provocation. Kuklinski's victims' families were haunted not only by their losses, but by his lack of remorse. For them, hearing him speak about their loved ones as mere footnotes in his criminal career was a gut-wrenching reminder of the pain he had inflicted. But it was Kuklinski's interaction with interviewers that left audiences most disturbed. His subtle threats and icy glares created an atmosphere of tension, as if he could still exert control, even from behind bars. One interviewer noted how his mood could shift in an instant, transforming from cooperative to menacing with a single question. This unpredictability added to his mystique, cementing his legacy as one of the most chilling figures in true crime history. But Kuklinski's cold detachment pales in comparison to Edmund Kemper's unsettling intelligence. With a calm, calculating demeanor, Kemper shared chilling details of his crimes that left even seasoned interviewers speechless.
The sight of Edmund Emil Kemper III is an awesome experience in itself. He stands 6 feet 9 inches tall and weighs about 280 pounds.
Edmund Kemper didn't look like a monster. Standing at a towering 6'9" with a sharp intellect and polite demeanor, he blended seamlessly into society. But beneath that calm surface was one of the most terrifying serial killers of the 20th century. Known as the Co-Ed Killer, Kemper's horrifying crime sent shockwaves through California in the 1970s. His unnerving interviews reveal a chilling detachment that still haunts anyone brave enough to watch. Born into a toxic household, Kemper's relationship with his mother, Clarnell, was the root of his twisted psyche. She berated him relentlessly, telling him he was worthless and incapable of finding love. Her mistreatment fed a deep-seated rage within him, a rage that would later erupt in unimaginable ways. At just 15, Kemper committed his first murders, killing his grandparents in cold blood. He was sent to a psychiatric hospital and diagnosed as a sociopath, but was deemed rehabilitated and released at 21. Free to roam, Kemper moved in with his mother, but her verbal abuse only escalated. Unable to confront her directly, he turned his anger onto unsuspecting victims. Kemper began picking up young female hitchhikers near college campuses. Once inside his car, he would lure them into a false sense of safety before brutally killing them. His methods were gruesome, stabbing, strangling, and even dismembering his victims. Kemper wasn't just a murderer, he was a predator who toyed with his victims' fear. The body count grew, 8 young women over the course of 11 months. Kemper's reign of terror ended in 1973, when he finally directed his fury at the source of his trauma, his mother. One night he bludgeoned her with a hammer, decapitated her, and performed unspeakable acts with her corpse. As if that weren't enough, he used her severed head as a target for dart practice. Kemper then invited his mother's best friend over, murdering her as well to stage the scene as a murder-suicide. But instead of fleeing, he did the unthinkable. He confessed. He called the police from a payphone and calmly detailed his crimes, ending with the haunting line, "I'm the one you're looking for." During his trial, Kemper's chilling intelligence and cooperation stood in stark contrast to his heinous acts. He described his murders with disturbing clarity, even explaining how he felt a sense of satisfaction as he was killing. He was convicted of 8 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. While incarcerated, Kemper is granted interviews that offer a terrifying glimpse into his mind. His calm demeanor, articulate speech, and openness about his crimes make him one of the most unsettling interviewees in history. At times, he appeared charming and almost likable, a facade that crumbled when his dark thoughts slipped through. The families of his victims were left shattered, struggling to comprehend how someone so seemingly normal could commit such atrocities. Kemper's interviews have only added to their pain, as his lack of remorse underscores the depth of his depravity. His mother, the woman he blamed for his monstrous actions, never lived to see the destruction she helped create. But her absence didn't bring peace to the victims' families.
When I read that article, I just broke down and I just cried and I cried.
In interviews, Kemper's chilling admissions continue to fascinate and horrify the public. His ability to speak so casually about his crimes, even joking at times, sends shivers down anyone who watches. He once admitted that his murders were an outlet, a way to release the rage he couldn't direct at his mother while she was alive. Next, we turn to the horrifying case of Danny Rolling, the Gainesville Ripper, whose reign of terror shocked a college town and left countless lives shattered.
The case involves mass panic at a major university.
There's a maniac on the loose, and no one knows who he is or when he'll strike again.
In the summer of 1990, the college town of Gainesville, Florida, turned from a bustling haven for University of Florida students to a city gripped by terror. Within just 3 days, 5 young students were found brutally murdered in their off-campus apartments. The level of violence was shocking, but even more chilling was the precision with which the killer operated, always leaving behind a grotesque and disturbing crime scene. The police were stumped. Gainesville descended into panic as students fled the city. barricaded themselves indoors, and stocked up on weapons. No one knew who the killer was or who would be next. The predator had seemingly disappeared without a trace.
It stands as one of 1990's most shocking stories.
18-year-old Sonia Larson was found murdered. 17-year-old Christina.
The Gainesville Ripper's spree began on August 24, 1990, when 17-year-old Sonia Larson and 18-year-old Christina Powell were found dead in their apartment. The killer broke in during the night, attacking them as they slept. The following day, 18-year-old Krista Hoyt, who worked part-time at the sheriff's office, became his next victim. The brutality escalated. Krista's body was mutilated and staged, a signature of the killer's twisted mind. By August 27, Rolling claimed his final victims, Tracy Pauls and her roommate, Manny Taboda. Unlike his previous targets, Manny fought back, but the killer overpowered him. Tracy, hearing the struggle, tried to hide but was mercilessly hunted down. Each victim was violated, mutilated, and posed, transforming their final moments into a horrific spectacle. For the people of Gainesville, it was clear this wasn't just random violence. It was the work of an evil mind. While Gainesville police scrambled for leads, Danny Rolling had already left town. He continued committing burglaries across Florida to survive. It wasn't until September 1990 that police arrested him in Ocala during a routine burglary investigation. At first, they had no idea Rolling was the Gainesville Ripper. The breakthrough came when evidence from the burglary, including tools, duct tape, and a screwdriver, was linked to the Gainesville crime scenes. Investigators also uncovered chilling audio tapes Rolling had recorded, describing his violent fantasies. DNA testing confirmed the worst. Danny Rolling was their killer. Rolling's trial began in 1994, and the court heard the horrifying details of his crimes. Instead of contesting the charges, Rolling shocked the room by pleading guilty to all 5 murders. He admitted to stalking his victims, breaking into their homes, and acting out his darkest fantasies. The jury wasted no time. Rolling was sentenced to death for his crimes, and in 2006, he was executed by lethal injection. Even in his final moments, he showed no true remorse for the terror and grief he had caused.
There was a mixture of joy, relief, sadness, anger. Every emotional stage of grief happened in a matter of seconds.
The Gainesville community was left forever scarred. Parents mourned futures stolen from their children, while investigators, many shaken by the brutality they witnessed, grappled with the weight of the case. Rolling's ability to blend into ordinary life while harboring such darkness left the community shaken to its core. Memorials to the victims still stand, a tribute to their lives and a stark reminder that evil can hide in plain sight. Danny Rolling's reign of terror unquestionably shattered a community, but our next case reveals a killer whose methods were even more calculated and chilling.
Israel Keyes was an American serial killer who committed murders between 2001 and 2012. He was known for his meticulous planning, preparation.
Israel Keyes, one of the most methodical and elusive serial killers in history. When it comes to serial killers, few are as terrifying as Israel Keyes, a man who methodically planned his crimes with chilling precision, leaving virtually no trace behind. Unlike many killers who act on impulse, Keyes approached murder as though it were a twisted art form. He traveled across the country, burying kill kits filled with weapons, cash, and supplies to ensure his crimes were swift, silent, and efficient. What made him even more terrifying? He chose his victims at random, making anyone a potential target. Keyes' terrifying methods came to light in 2012 when he abducted Samantha Koenig, an 18-year-old barista from her workplace in Anchorage, Alaska. Surveillance footage captured a masked figure forcing Samantha out of the coffee stand at gunpoint. Her sudden disappearance sent shockwaves through the community. Days later, Samantha's boyfriend and family began receiving chilling text messages demanding ransom. But what no one knew at the time was that Samantha was already dead. Keyes had brutally murdered her hours after the abduction. To create the illusion that Samantha was still alive, he staged photos of her body holding a newspaper and used them as proof of the ransom negotiations. While the family clung to hope, Keyes was already moving on. He boarded a flight to Texas, where he used Samantha's bank card to withdraw funds.
While in Arizona, he put on a different outfit and a mask and withdrew $400 from Samantha's bank account. This activity immediately alerted the FBI,
making one critical mistake that would eventually lead to his downfall. Keyes' use of Samantha's bank card allowed authorities to track his movements across the southern United States. In March 2012, during a routine traffic stop in Lufkin, Texas, Keyes was arrested. Investigators soon connected him to Samantha's disappearance. However, as they questioned him further, they began to unravel something far more sinister. In a series of chilling confessions, Keyes admitted to multiple murders spanning over a decade. He revealed how he would fly to random cities, rent cars, and drive for hundreds of miles to avoid detection. He buried kill kits, buckets filled with guns, duct tape, rope, and cash across remote locations, returning years later to commit his crimes. He boasted about his ability to avoid leaving evidence, describing his actions as the perfect crimes. Investigators were stunned. Unlike most serial killers, Keyes had no clear pattern, no type of victim, and no connection to his targets. His randomness made him nearly impossible to track. While awaiting trial, Keyes' behavior remained unnerving. He alternated between cold indifference and chilling arrogance, toying with investigators as he described his crimes in horrifying detail. Despite confessing to at least 11 murders, Keyes refused to reveal all of his victims' names, holding the truth as a final power play. On December 2, 2012, Keyes was found dead in his jail cell. He had committed suicide, leaving behind a cryptic note that offered no closure or answers to his remaining crimes. For investigators and the families of his victims, Keyes' death was a bitter end. Justice would never be fully served, and many of his victims would remain nameless and forgotten. The story of Israel Keyes sent chills through law enforcement and the public alike. His ability to evade detection for so long, combined with the sheer randomness of his crimes, exposed the unsettling vulnerability of anyone who crossed his path. For Samantha Koenig's family, Keyes' arrest brought devastating answers but no solace. Their daughter's life was stolen in an act of senseless cruelty by a man who viewed murder as a calculated game. Even seasoned investigators were shaken by Keyes' meticulous planning and his chilling lack of remorse. His ability to blend into society while hiding such depravity made him a unique and terrifying figure in the world of crime. Though his death ended his reign of terror, the unanswered questions and lingering mysteries surrounding his other victims ensure that his case remains as haunting as ever. While Israel Keyes left authorities scrambling to uncover his twisted methods, our next case takes us back to the notorious Charles Manson, a man who led a cult that would commit some of the most infamous murders in history.
In Los Angeles, Charles Manson went to court today.
Charles Manson said he was happy today, that he is always happy, even though he is charged with 7 murders.
In the late 1960s, Los Angeles was a city of glitz, glamour, and hope for a better future. But beneath the surface, a sinister force was at work. Charles Manson, an ex-con drifter with dreams of fame, built a deadly following that would bring terror to Hollywood's doorstep. What began as a twisted ideology spiraled into one of the most infamous killing sprees in American history.
One of the most shocking evils, the night he directed his followers to target a Beverly Hills home. Inside, they murdered 5 people.
Manson styled himself as a prophet, preaching his bizarre doctrine of an impending race war, which he called Helter Skelter. With a mix of manipulation, charm, and LSD-fueled control, Manson attracted young, impressionable followers to his so-called family. He convinced them that violence was the path to survival, and that his twisted vision would lead them to power. In August 1969, Manson's cult of killers unleashed their reign of terror. On the night of August 8th, actress Sharon Tate, 8 months pregnant at the time, and 4 others were brutally slaughtered in her Beverly Hills home. The following evening, Leno and Rosemary LaBianca were murdered in similarly horrifying fashion. The scenes were gruesome, walls smeared with blood and chilling words like pig scrawled across surfaces. Manson hadn't even wielded a weapon, yet his influence orchestrated every brutal act. The public was paralyzed by fear, as Hollywood's elite grappled with the reality that no one was safe. Police struggled to link the murders together until a breakthrough came from the most unlikely source, jailhouse gossip. Susan Atkins, one of Manson's followers, bragged to a fellow inmate about the killings, revealing that Charles Manson had masterminded the attacks to ignite his apocalyptic prophecy. The trial that followed was as shocking as the crimes. Manson, with his wild, hypnotic stare, carved an X into his forehead. His followers disrupted court proceedings, chanting and demonstrating their blind loyalty. Even more unsettling were the accused murderers' chilling lack of remorse.
In the bizarre circus-like trial, Mastermind Manson and Atkins, Krenwinkel and Van Hout were found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to death.
In January 1971, Charles Manson and 3 of his female followers, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten, were convicted of murder and conspiracy. The court sentenced Manson to death, but his sentence was later reduced to life in prison when California abolished the death penalty. Manson spent the rest of his life behind bars, a haunting symbol of manipulation and madness until his death in 2017. The Manson murders left deep scars on the American psyche, marking the end of the carefree 1960s, a decade once defined by peace and love. The sheer brutality of the killings and Manson's manipulation of his followers shocked the world, forcing society to confront the disturbing reality of how easily individuals can be swayed to commit horrific acts. Charles Manson's name remains a chilling symbol of manipulation, cult influence, and senseless violence. Even in prison, he was unrepentant, embodying the power of twisted ideology to corrupt and destroy. His followers, who once sought belonging and purpose, became accomplices to one of history's darkest crimes, forever cementing their roles in the tragedy. Charles Manson manipulated his followers to commit unspeakable horrors, but our next case reveals a killer who didn't rely on others. Ted Bundy, a man whose charm concealed a monstrous darkness, terrorized an entire nation.
Well, I just been with the most dangerous man in the western states. Never had a clue.
In the 1970s, the United States was gripped by terror as a charming law student turned out to be one of history's most horrifying serial killers. Ted Bundy, handsome, articulate, and seemingly normal, committed brutal crimes that shattered the illusion of safety for women across the country. Beneath his polished exterior was a manipulative predator who would leave behind a trail of devastation and broken families.
Linda Ann Healy had been due to record her daily ski report for the local radio station. She never arrived.
Bundy's killing spree began in 1974, targeting young women in Washington state, before spreading across Oregon, Utah, Colorado, and Florida. His method was both cunning and chilling. He feigned injuries or posed as a law enforcement officer to gain his victims' trust. Women who believed they were helping a man with a broken arm or receiving assistance from an authority figure soon found themselves trapped. Bundy would overpower his victims, abducting them before subjecting them to brutal violence. As reports of missing women escalated, law enforcement pieced together details of the elusive killer. Witnesses described a man named Ted driving a brown Volkswagen Beetle, and police were closing in. Bundy was arrested for the first time in 1975 when a routine traffic stop revealed suspicious items in his car: masks, handcuffs, and burglary tools. Though Bundy was linked to some crimes, the full extent of his atrocities remained hidden. What followed was as surreal as it was horrifying. While awaiting trial in Colorado, Bundy managed to escape custody twice. In his most infamous escape, he crawled through a jail ceiling and walked out of the building dressed as a civilian. Now a fugitive, Bundy made his way to Florida, where his spree reached its darkest point. In January 1978, Bundy entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. In a frenzied attack, he assaulted 4 women, killing 2 and leaving 2 others severely injured. Just weeks later, he abducted and murdered 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, a crime that would haunt investigators and solidify Bundy as a monster beyond comprehension. Bundy's capture came on February 15, 1978, after being pulled over in a stolen car. This time, the evidence was overwhelming, and Bundy could no longer hide behind his charm. He was charged with multiple counts of murder, setting the stage for one of the most sensational trials in U.S. history.
I deserve the most extreme punishment society has. I think society deserves to be protected from me and from others like me, that's for sure.
Bundy represented himself in court, using the trial as a stage to manipulate the media and bask in the attention. He cross-examined witnesses, delivered his own defense, and even proposed marriage to a woman in the middle of proceedings. But no amount of theatrics could erase the damning evidence. Bite mark analysis, eyewitness testimonies, and forensic details tied Bundy to the murders. In 1979, Bundy was convicted of the Chi Omega murders and sentenced to death. The verdict marked a turning point. Gone was the confident man who once smiled for the cameras. Bundy became desperate, cycling through appeals and manipulative confessions to delay his fate.
Rubin also writes about the many women victimized by Ted Bundy, most not as fortunate to have survived.
Because being a victim and having my voice and my story told bothered me that they never had the chance.
For the families of Bundy's victims, the trial brought both justice and unbearable grief. Mothers, fathers, and siblings sat in the courtroom, hearing the brutal details of what their loved ones endured. Bundy's cold detachment only deepened their pain. Outside the prison, public anger boiled over. As Bundy's execution date approached, crowds gathered with signs reading "Burn, Bundy, burn." The execution itself, on January 24, 1989, was met with cheers. For many, it felt like a long-awaited end to a nightmare. But even in death, Bundy's legacy is a chilling reminder of the darkness that can exist behind the most convincing masks. While Bundy used his charm to mask his monstrous crimes, our next killer took on a far more sinister persona. John Wayne Gacy, known as the Killer Clown, turned the guise of innocence into a horrifying nightmare for his unsuspecting victims.
Tonight on News Extra, a portrait of a killer. Paintings and diaries that provide a frightening view inside the mind of the worst mass killer in American history.
In the 1970s, the Chicago suburbs seemed like a safe and quiet place to live. But behind the smiling face of a community man known for entertaining children as Pogo the Clown hid one of the most prolific and disturbing serial killers in American history, John Wayne Gacy. Gacy's name is now synonymous with pure evil, but it wasn't just his crimes that shocked the world. It was his chilling demeanor in the courtroom that left everyone speechless.
Gacy was now a family man, a rising star in the local business world, and a popular member of the community. On the surface, it was a storybook existence.
John Wayne Gacy lived a double life. By day, he was a successful contractor, a local volunteer, and a man who neighbors said could get along with anyone. But behind closed doors, he lured teenage boys and young men to his home under the pretense of job offers, parties, or simple acts of trust. Once inside, his victims faced unimaginable terror. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy tortured, assaulted, and murdered at least 33 young men and boys. He buried 29 of their bodies in the crawl space of his suburban home in Norwood Park Township, while others were discarded in nearby rivers. For years, Gacy's crimes went unnoticed, partly because of his ability to hide in plain sight and manipulate those around him. Gacy's reign of terror finally began to unravel in December 1978, when 15-year-old Robert Peast vanished after telling his family he was going to meet a contractor about a job. That contractor was John Wayne Gacy. Peast's disappearance triggered an investigation that led detectives straight to Gacy's door. When officers searched his home, the horror they uncovered was beyond comprehension. The smell of decay permeated the crawl space, where bodies had been stacked on top of each other, some for years. Investigators removed 29 victims from beneath the house, each body telling its own story of suffering. The sheer scale of Gacy's crimes shocked the nation and earned him the title, the Killer Clown. When Gacy was brought to trial in 1980, his calm and confident demeanor stood in stark contrast to the gravity of his crimes. He showed no remorse, often making jokes or dismissing his actions.
After he was convicted for the torture murder of 33 young men and boys, John Wayne Gacy has been executed.
The trial lasted only 5 weeks, but its impact would echo for decades. Gacy's chilling courtroom behavior, smirking, joking, and acting indifferent, only added to the public's disgust. The jury took less than 2 hours to deliberate before finding him guilty of 33 counts of murder. It was the most convictions ever handed down for a single person at the time. Gacy was sentenced to death. On May 10, 1994, after years of legal appeals, he was executed by lethal injection. His final words, "Kiss my ass," cemented his legacy as a man who refused to take accountability for his actions, even in his final moments.
John Wayne Gacy is remembered as one of the evilest men to ever walk the earth. For physically exploiting and taking the lives of innocent boys and men, he was sentenced to execution.
Survivors' families spoke of anger, loss, and heartbreak. Many found some comfort in knowing Gacy could no longer harm anyone, but the scars he left behind remain to this day. The case also changed how law enforcement approached missing person investigations and shaped the way society viewed the friendly neighbor next door. Next, we confront the horrifying case of Gary Ridgeway, one of the most notorious serial killers in history. A twisted tale of darkness and the relentless pursuit of justice. This is one you won't forget.
Mr. Ridgeway, how do you plead to the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree, as charged in count 1 for the death of Wendy Lee Caulfield?
Guilty.
Gary Ridgeway is considered the second most prolific killer in United States history. Also known as the Green River Killer, Ridgeway murdered somewhere between 71 and 99 adult workers between 1982 and 1998. He seemed to have an undisclosed hatred for adult workers and prostitutes, as these were all of his victims. Gary Ridgeway's childhood was anything but ordinary. His father complained about the presence of adult workers often. His mother was described as a domineering woman, and relatives said that Ridgeway may have witnessed more than one violent argument between his parents.
He talked about having some sexual feelings towards her. He described in some detail watching her when she was in a bathing suit and looking at her and thinking that she dressed pretty provocatively.
Ridgeway had a bedwetting problem until he was 13 years old. After every episode, his mother used to forcefully wash his private parts. This was what probably introduced Ridgeway into a love-hate relationship with sexual intimacy. He told psychologists later on that he had conflicted feelings of anger and attraction toward his mother, and would consider killing her, fantasizing about it. When Ridgeway was 16, he stabbed a 6-year-old boy through his ribs into his liver. The boy survived the attack, and Ridgeway didn't face severe consequences. He was married 3 times to 3 different women. Ridgeway and his second wife had a son together, but their marriage failed because Ridgeway was constantly unfaithful.
So I whipped out my ID, and with my ID would be I'd put my finger over my driver's license to hide my name, but on the opposite side was pictures.
In the 1980s, Ridgeway targeted adult workers in Washington and gained their trust by showing them a photo of his son. He would lure them into his car, and when they traveled far enough, Ridgeway killed them. He either strangled them with his hands or used garrots. Afterward, he would dump their bodies in wooded areas and often go back to engage in necrophilia before eventually burying his victims. It was later revealed that even though Ridgeway claimed to hate adult workers, he would engage in intercourse with his victims before killing them. After 6 women were found this way, a task force was opened to try and find him. Despite this, Ridgeway would not be arrested for these serial killings for almost 20 years. Even though he was a suspect as early as 1982, he somehow stayed free. He also passed a polygraph test in 1994, therefore reducing the suspicion towards him. In 2001, because of advances in DNA testing technology, investigators were able to re-examine evidence from the crime scenes and found abundant DNA belonging to Ridgeway. On November 30th, 2001, Ridgeway was arrested as he was leaving his workplace. The investigation lasted a long time because in an earlier interview, he claimed that he had murdered at least 71 people. He didn't cooperate with police as they'd like, and he eventually cut a deal with the police.
Mr. Ridgeway, how do you plead to the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree as charged in count 1 for the death of Wendy Lee Caulfield?
Guilty.
Eventually, he took a plea deal in exchange for providing information on where to find the remains of his other victims. Ridgeway pled guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. The plea deal also spared him the death penalty in exchange for more information about his victims.
There are people here that hate you. I'm not one of them. You've made it difficult to live up to what I believe, and that is what God says to do, and that's to forgive. You are forgiven.
During his sentencing, Ridgeway admitted to killing at least 71 adult workers. Ridgeway showed no emotion whatsoever. He pleaded guilty to all 48 counts. During victim impact statements, Ridgeway remained mostly emotionless. However, when the father of one of his victims said he forgave him, Ridgeway became emotional and cried a bit. Ultimately, he was sentenced to 48 life sentences and 10 years each for tampering with the evidence of those 48 cases he pleaded guilty to. He's serving his sentence in the Washington State Penitentiary. Next, we turn to the notorious case of Joseph DeAngelo, a man whose reign of terror earned him the name the Golden State Killer. For years, he was a ghost, a phantom that haunted California, leaving a trail of terror, violence, and unanswered questions. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr., better known as the Golden State Killer, committed at least 13 murders and 50 across California between 1974 and 1986. His crimes went unsolved for decades, becoming one of America's most notorious cold cases. DeAngelo's reign of terror began in the mid-1970s in Visalia, California. Known then as the Visalia Ransacker, he would break into homes, vandalize personal property, and steal small items. But his crimes quickly escalated. By 1976, he had moved to the Sacramento area, where he became known as the East Area. His modus operandi was chilling. He would stalk his victims, often entering their homes beforehand to unlock windows or plant ligatures. Then, in the dead of night, he would strike. DeAngelo would wake his victims with a flashlight beam and threats of violence. He often tied up male victims and stacked dishes on their backs, warning them that if he heard the dishes fall, he'd kill everyone in the house. He would then violate the female victims, sometimes repeatedly, over hours.
He preyed on people in Carmichael, Citrus Heights, and Rancho Cordova, often targeting couples. While raping the women, he would psychologically torture their husbands, tying them up and placing dishes on their back, threatening them not to move.
As fear gripped Sacramento, DeAngelo's attacks became bolder. He began targeting couples using the same tactics of binding, threats, and assaults. In 1978, he committed his first known murders, killing Brian and Katie Maggiore in Rancho Cordova. DeAngelo then moved his hunting grounds south to the Santa Barbara area, where he became known as the original Night Stalker. Here, his violence escalated further. He murdered at least 8 more people between 1979 and 1986, including couples in their homes. One of his most brutal attacks occurred in 1980 when he murdered Charlene and Lyman Smith in their Ventura County home. Charlene was violated before both were bludgeoned to death with a fireplace log. For years, investigators didn't connect these crimes. The East Area rapist and the original Night Stalker were thought to be separate offenders. It wasn't until DNA testing in 2001 that authorities realized they were dealing with a single perpetrator. The case went cold for decades. DeAngelo, a former police officer, seemed to vanish into thin air after 1986. Victims lived in fear, never knowing if their attacker would return. Families of the murdered were left without closure, their loved ones' cases unsolved. Then, in 2018, a breakthrough came. Investigators used DNA from a crime scene and uploaded it to a genealogy website. This led them to distant relatives of the killer. Through painstaking work, they narrowed their search and finally identified Joseph DeAngelo as their suspect.
A breakthrough in 2018. Law enforcement plugged DNA material taken from a crime scene into a website called GEDmatch, which compares the genealogical data of family members.
On April 24, 2018, DeAngelo was arrested in his home in Citrus Heights, California. The man who had eluded capture for over 40 years was finally in custody. DNA evidence conclusively linked him to multiple crime scenes.
On April 24, 2018, police arrested Joseph James DeAngelo.
The arrest sent shockwaves through California and the true crime community. The Golden State Killer, a boogeyman who had haunted the state for decades, now had a face, a name, and a backstory that seemed jarringly ordinary. As details of DeAngelo's life emerged, the contrast was stark. He had worked as a police officer in Exeter and Auburn, California during the 1970s. He had been married, raised 3 daughters, and lived a seemingly normal life in the same area he had once terrorized. But on August 21, 2020, the day of reckoning finally arrived. DeAngelo, now a 74-year-old man, stood in a makeshift courtroom in Sacramento State University's ballroom, converted due to the COVID-19 precautions. The air was thick with tension as survivors and family members of his victims gathered to witness justice being served. As the proceedings began, the weight of DeAngelo's crimes became evident. Prosecutor Tien Ho painted a chilling picture of the man before them.
His monikers reflect the sweeping geographical impact of his crimes. The Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, the original Night Stalker, and the Golden State Killer.
But it was the victims' impact statements that truly brought home the horror of DeAngelo's actions. For 3 days, survivors and family members took the stand, their voices trembling with emotion as they recounted their experiences. One survivor, Chris Pedretti, who was violated by DeAngelo when she was just 15, looked him in the eye and declared,
"I was a normal 15-year-old kid. I loved going to school, having sleepovers, and going to church."
Another victim, Patty Cosper, daughter of survivor Patricia Murphy, read a statement on her mother's behalf. "May he rot in hell," Cosper spat, her voice filled with decades of pain and anger. As the statements continued, a pattern emerged. DeAngelo's victims weren't just recounting their trauma, they were reclaiming their power. Each statement seemed to chip away at the monster's facade, revealing the coward beneath. Then came the moment everyone was waiting for. Judge Michael Bowman prepared to deliver the sentence. The courtroom held its breath. Would the punishment fit the crime? Could any sentence truly bring justice after so many years? Judge Bowman's voice rang out, clear and firm.
Another way to state the sentence is as follows. Mr. DeAngelo is sentenced to a total of 11 life without the possibility of parole sentences, plus an additional life sentence, plus an additional 8 years.
The reaction was immediate. A collective exhale swept through the room, followed by muffled sobs and whispers. Some victims clasped hands, others nodded solemnly. The monster who had haunted their nightmares for so long was finally caged. But the most surprising reaction came from D'Angelo himself. The man who had terrorized so many, who had eluded capture for decades, now sat slumped in his wheelchair. As the judge read out his crimes, D'Angelo's face remained impassive, almost bored. It was a stark contrast to the predator he once was. Then, in a move that stunned the courtroom, D'Angelo slowly rose from his wheelchair. He turned to face the gallery, his eyes scanning the faces of those he had hurt. For a moment, it seemed like he might finally show remorse, offer an explanation, or beg for forgiveness. Instead, in a barely audible voice, he uttered just 5 words.
I've listened to all your statements, each one of them, and I'm truly sorry.
The reaction was mixed. Some saw it as a final insult, a half-hearted apology that couldn't begin to make up for the pain he'd caused. Others felt a sense of closure, finally hearing the killer acknowledge his crimes, even if only briefly. As D'Angelo was wheeled out of the courtroom to begin his life sentence, the atmosphere shifted. The monster was gone, but his legacy of pain remained. Yet there was also a sense of triumph. The survivors had faced their tormentor and emerged victorious. In the days following the sentencing, reactions continued to pour in. Law enforcement officials who had worked tirelessly on the case for years expressed relief and satisfaction. Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert called it the most prolific serial predator in California history, emphasizing the significance of the conviction. But perhaps the most poignant reactions came from the survivors themselves. Many spoke of a weight being lifted, of finally being able to close a chapter that had been left open for far too long.
No 13-year-old should have to find out what a rape kit is.
It had been all over the local news about the man they called the Visalia ransacker, who was breaking into people's houses, going through underwear drawers, and taking items of no value. I could never imagine that the man who had been stalking me and peering in my bedroom window during the previous months would end up changing my life forever.
He ate from my refrigerator and he drank 2 beers, while I lay bound and blindfolded, unclothed and freezing on the hardwood floor in front of an open door in the cold March night.
These killers' interviews gave us a terrifying glimpse into the minds of true monsters. Moments of rage, delusion, and chilling calmness that still haunt those who witnessed them. But this is just the beginning. The next video on screen dives into more unsettling crimes and the shocking reactions that left the world speechless. Don't miss it.